We do have a lot to go over today, so I'm just going to jump right on in. The thing that we're looking at today are the disclosures, and there are 4 main seller disclosures that we need to go over. And can anybody run that list down with me?
Seller's property disclosure,
Property disclosure.
seller's property disclosure of latent defects.
Say that again. We're going to hit that one. Both of those are a seller's property disclosure.
Oh, so what? I missed the question, Trace. Say that again. Sorry.
What are the 4 types of disclosures that the sellers may have to make? So
Community
lead.
association,
community association,
Lead,
lead,
seller's property disclosure.
that was the first one.
the
Okay.
DeKalb County Water.
The DeKalb County Plumbing and Water. Yes, you got
Okay.
all 4. So, and that's what we're going through today. This is some of you guys already know these pretty well. And the seller's property disclosure is one every single home should have, but they don't. Not every seller is going to be on board. Not every agent's going to take it serious and really do the job that they should do. I'm of the firm belief that the main reason that we don't always have a seller's property disclosure is not because of the client, it's because of the agent being lazy. And I just want to ask and encourage you guys, don't be that agent. You ought to have really good scripts around why the seller should do it and why they should include it. Number one being, if I'm a prospective buyer looking at a property and my agent is telling me, well, it'd be really nice if we had a seller's property disclosure, and there's not one, or I'm getting pushback, what's my first thought?
That they're trying to hide something.
That they're trying to hide something, okay? And the second thing is the seller is legally obligated, and you as the agent are legally obligated to disclose any known latent defects with the property. A latent defect being a hidden flaw, a hidden defect in the property. If there is a 3-foot hole in the wall in the living room, we don't have to disclose that because any routine inspection is going to uncover that. But if we've got a pinhole leak in the refrigerant line for the AC system, if there's a slow leak in the roof or water coming into the basement, depending on what weather we've had the last week, might that not show up? Might not. And even a skilled inspector may not know that that's an issue. And so those things have to be disclosed. And here's the thing, if there's a defect at the property that doesn't get discovered until after closing, if it was not disclosed, what's the buyer going to want to do? Sue the seller, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, as long as they disclosed it on the seller's property disclosure that it was an issue and they went through closing, there's no claim. The buyer bought that knowing full well that was an issue. Now, whether they read the disclosure, paid attention to the disclosure, understood the disclosure, that doesn't matter. They were told this was an issue. So the seller's property disclosure really protects your selling clients, your sellers. And so I want to encourage you guys, have really good scripts around presenting it and getting their engagement. And the reason that we have 2 now is one's a long form, one's a short form. You may get pushback on the long form, which is the first one we're going to look at, but it ought to be really easy to get your client to fill in the short form because it only takes a few minutes. And when we get to the end of these, you'll see that there's also a personal property checklist or a fixtures checklist, if you will. That's the leverage that you can use to get them to sign. Even for that investor that has never lived in the house and doesn't know anything about the house, they know whether they're going to include the refrigerator or not. They know whether or not they're going to leave the light bulbs or not. The buyer doesn't. So the reason we can tell them that we want the disclosure is for the property checklist, and they ought to be willing to do it for that reason and that reason alone. Okay. That way there is no argument down the road about what stays and what goes. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Awesome. And as we take a closer look, you'll see even better why that is, because a lot of that stuff on that personal property checklist you would think is obvious, but has wound up in court at some point being an issue, and that's the reason it's on that list. So we're starting out with the long form seller's property disclosure statement, and that's the title of the form. We're typically going to have this done at the listing appointment or very shortly after, because ideally we want to be able to load this for prospective buyers to include in their offer. And since they're including it in their offer, do we know what exhibit letter to put with it?
Not yet.
Not yet. We could pick one, but then they're going to have to match what we put. My suggestion is leave the exhibit letter blank, leave the offer date blank, because we don't know when that prospective buyer is going to make an offer. We can fill in the address, okay, because that we know for sure. And on this form, that is the only thing I want you filling in, okay? You want your client filling everything else in. And my suggestion is I always have my clients fill this out pen on paper, because trying to fill this out digitally can be very challenging. Getting the check boxes to check or not can be difficult to hit exactly the right little spot. I'm always going to get it with my pen though. It's also, they may struggle with the technology in filling it out that way. I want them pen and paper on the seller's property disclosure. That way they also can't come back later and debate whether or not you put that in there or they put that in there. It's in there and it's in their handwriting. They own it. Okay. And I'll explain why that's important here in a minute. But the rest of this form is going to walk your seller through different parts of the house and different categories, from just general information. When was the house built? Is it vacant? Is it occupied? It's going to ask them if it's in an HOA. Was it built before 1978? And in all of these, and this continues on, anytime they answer yes to a question, we want to put an explanation in here. Why did they check yes? Okay. If it's no, there's no explanation needed. And there's enough space under every paragraph for an explanation. And if there's not enough room there, there's a bigger section at the end for them to put any additional comments. But have them go through and mark everything. I'm there to help my clients. If they have questions about what they should mark or not mark, they can call me. Okay. Anything they don't know the answer to, what should they do?
Leave it blank.
Leave it blank. I wish that they would go back to the form we had 6 or 7 years ago, that it was yes, no, or unknown. That made it really easy for sellers. They got rid of the unknown column. So yes or no. If they don't know, leave it blank.
Could they write the word unknown? Like it says approximate age of water heater. Could they put unknown years?
They could.
Okay.
Because again, this is a disclosure, and the requirement is only that they disclose the latent defects. All the other disclosures in here, all the other questions are designed just to give the buyer confidence. So let them know that it's not that we don't want to tell them that it's 22 years old. We don't know how old it is. For me, that's better than putting in there 22. But if I know it's 22 years old, do I need to put 22 years old?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So goes through the different systems and components, the sewer and the plumbing. It's going to go through the roofs and the gutters, the flooding, draining, moisture, soil. Goes through questions about termites, environmental health, all of these different categories. This is the big paragraph that I was telling you where you can put the additional explanations for anything they had to mark yes. And then we get to the fixtures checklist. And this is where we've had so many lawsuits and so many issues, because once upon a time, we felt like it was pretty clear what was a fixture and what wasn't a fixture. If it was permanently attached, it was a fixture. Well, is your stove permanently attached in your house?
Yes.
No, it's
No.
it's plugged in
It's
and
plugged
slid
in.
into place, unless it's a gas stove and then there's a gas line that's ran to it. So there's a debate. Is that a fixture? Is that not a fixture? What about the light bulbs in your house? Is that a fixture or not a fixture?
Not a fixture.
No.
Not a fixture.
But how are you going to feel as the buyer of a house if you go to move in and the seller took every single light bulb out of the house and packed them up and took them with him? Right? Buyers had an expectation that the light bulbs were staying. It used to be really obvious mirrors in bathrooms because they were always glued to the wall, right? Well, what's the latest trend is they're framed mirrors that are hung on the wall. So how would you like it if you were to go move into your new house and the mirrors had been taken away? Probably not going to be a happy camper. And so that's why this list has become so important that people fill it out. And some of the things on here that are newer is the thermostat. You know, the idea is people were buying a house that had a nice Nest thermostat in there. And when they went to move in, somebody had taken their Nest thermostat away and it installed a basic generic thermostat. And their argument was, that's not what I made an offer on. That's not what I bought. And it's wound up in lawsuits. So these are great conversations for you to have already with your seller about what they intend to leave. Okay. And there's some clarifying questions under here. So let's say that you have more than one refrigerator. You've got an extra refrigerator in the garage, and we've marked up here that the refrigerator is staying. Well, down here, what we need to do is explain that the refrigerator in the kitchen is staying, the one in the garage is being moved, or the one in the kitchen is being moved and the one in the garage is being put in its place. So if we mark something, we have to leave all of that something unless we put it here. Okay. One of the other issues that we run into is that people walk into a house and they see that there is a dishwasher and you have marked that the dishwasher is staying. Do people assume that the dishwasher works?
Yes.
Yeah, and they should. So we have a paragraph down here that if there's anything that we are leaving that is in need of repair or replacement, we need to indicate in there that it's not working, okay, that it's staying. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is when we mark this, that something is staying, we're talking about the item that is in place right now, okay? So if there's any intentions for you to take the chandelier with you and put up a different chandelier, we need to include in here in this clarification paragraph or up here in additional explanations that we're going to be removing the chandelier in the foyer and replacing with a different chandelier. Okay, because that can cause problems down the road as well. Or you have to make sure that that's clearly put in the purchase and sales agreement is the other place that we can put it, but then we're having to remember to add that later. I would rather have it put in here because then there isn't a debate and the offer already has that built in. Because if you found out that my antique chandelier that's big and beautiful is being replaced with a little tiny builder quality chandelier, might you offer a different price for the house? Yeah.
Yep.
I'd rather have that indicated ahead of time. Okay. And then your sellers are going to sign at the bottom. Okay. And then leave the buyers for when they make the offer, they will fill this out. Now, the reason that I don't want you filling this out, 5 years ago now, we had an agent in our office that had just come from closing. They represented the sellers and they got a phone call from the buyer's agent and say, hey, the buyers just went to move in and the refrigerator is gone. Need the sellers to bring that back. And the agent said, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. It was probably moved by the moving company accidentally. Let me call the sellers. We'll get this worked out. Calls his client. The client says, well, we were always taking the refrigerator with us. We never intended to leave the refrigerator. So he calls the buyer's agent back and says, hey, I just talked to my client. The refrigerator wasn't part of the transaction. They never had any intentions for the refrigerator. So your buyers are going to have to make arrangements to get their own refrigerator. And the listing agent said, that won't work because the seller's property disclosure says that they would be leaving the refrigerator. And this guy's like, oh my gosh, are you sure? Let me go back. He checks. Sure enough, it does. He says, all right, let me call the sellers. I'll get this worked out. And he calls the sellers and he says, hey guys, you say that you intended to take the refrigerator with you, but you marked on the seller's property disclosure that the refrigerator was staying. And the client said, well, we didn't fill that out. You filled that out. We told you that we were taking the refrigerator with us. Guess who took their brand new commission check and had to go buy a refrigerator that day? That kind of sucks, doesn't it? I don't want you guys buying anybody's refrigerators. So have your clients fill this out. That way the responsibility falls back on them. Now you can question them. You can let them know, hey, in paragraph 7, you marked yes, that there was a repair during the ownership, but you didn't give an explanation. Can you go ahead and just add in there a brief description of what was done? Roof was replaced 3 years ago. Perfect. That's all that you need. They didn't mark that they were leaving the ceiling fans in the property. You can ask them about that. Did you have intentions of taking the ceiling fans with you? No, we're leaving the ceiling fans. Great. Can you go back and mark that the ceiling fans are staying with the property? Okay. You can coach them through this. I just don't want you filling it out. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Perfect. I want 6 yeses. All right, I'll have to settle for 1.
Yes.
Perfect. All right.
Yes.
Now, you're going to have some clients that they're like, oh my gosh, this is a lot. I don't want to fill all this stuff in. I don't know this information. This was my parents' house. They passed away. That's the reason we're selling it. I don't know what to answer to most of this. Okay, great. I've got an abridged form that we can use instead. Okay, and we're going to fill this out the same way. We're going to leave the exhibit letter blank. We're going to leave the date blank. We'll fill in the address. They fill in everything else. Okay, and first we're going to talk about occupancy. The seller lives in the house or was the most recent occupant. The seller was not the most recent occupant of the property, meaning that his parents did, or a tenant lived in there, or seller has never occupied the property. They bought it as a flip, they renovated it, but they've never lived in there. Okay. Second question, seller hereby discloses the known latent defects. Well, if, as far as you know, there's no hidden defects of the property, mark no known latent defects. If they know that there's an issue, mark known latent defects and write out what that is. And if this isn't enough space, we've got a box to add an additional page. Is the property zoned agriculture or borders a property that's zoned agricultural? And that's all of it. So instead of those first 5 pages, that's all we have to fill in. And then we have exactly the same checklist of fixtures. And we're going to follow the same rules here. We have the same clarification if there's more than one refrigerator or more than one item and we're taking one. Same question around, is there anything that's broken that needs to be fixed or replaced? And then we have the buyer and seller signatures. So we're gonna have our seller signature and then we're gonna load that up onto our listing for prospective buyers to download and use. Easy enough. Any questions about these 2 forms and why we would use one and not the other?
So Trey, this is considered the shortlist form?
This is the short list form. Because really the only big question, instead of having to go and saying yes or no, yes or no, yes or no to all that long list of questions, we're just answering this one question. I don't know of any issues with the property. I'm not putting in here how old's the roof, how old's the water heater, how old is the HVAC system. I'm just saying, as far as I know, there's no issues with the property. Much shorter. Okay. This is very popular with people that have never lived in the home. So investors and inherited properties are strongly going to prefer this form. Because if I've never lived in the home and I didn't do a renovation, I haven't been renting the property out, because this is where people get into an issue, is you'll have a landlord that's selling the property. And I'll be, I never lived in the home. I don't know anything about the home. Well, you've owned the home for 6 years. Do you know if you ever replaced the roof? Have any of you ever accidentally spent $15,000 and forgot about it?
Mhm.
No,
No.
you know things about the home, right? Has the home ever flooded? You know, are there any issues with water coming into the basement? Have you ever had to file an insurance claim on the property? Just because you didn't live in the home doesn't mean you know nothing about the home. I don't expect you to know everything, but I want to know what you know about the home. And so that's where these forms come in. But those investors and those inherited properties, they strongly prefer the short form. Make good sense?
Yep.
All right, awesome.
Yes.
And let's move on to the next one, being the community association disclosure. This is where we're disclosing everything that the seller knows about the HOA. We're going to follow the same rules. We're not going to put in an exhibit letter. We're not going to put in an offer date. The buyer will put those in when they make the offer. We will fill in the address, and your client needs to fill in everything else. And this is a difficult document to do that. We are service-oriented people, and we want to make things as easy for our client as possible. And we would love to call the HOA, get the information for them, fill this out for them, and then all they have to do is sign it. But understand, when you do that, you are opening yourself up to all sorts of liability. You want them to do this. And when we get to the right paragraph, I will show you specifically why you want them doing this and not you. Okay. So first questions they're going to ask is, what type of association or associations will the buyer become a member? Now, for most homes, it's going to be a mandatory member association, the second one right here is your standard HOA, okay, that you're going to find in a neighborhood. The first one, the mandatory membership condominium, is your standard condo association. The third one is a mandatory master association. And this is where a lot of agents get confused, and there are not very many of these communities around, but there are some master planned communities where it's a group of neighborhoods together. That group of neighborhoods has a master association that maybe they've got the resort style pool and the huge pavilion, and they've got the lake, and that master association is responsible for all of that. But the neighborhood that you live in inside the master community has its own association. And very often the way these neighborhoods are set up is you pull in on a main parkway, and then you may have a little subdivision off to the left that is a active adult community. And everybody in there pays the master association so they can use the pool and the pavilion, but their little neighborhood takes care of the maintenance around the sign, does the exterior maintenance on the building, does their lawn maintenance, and may include their water bill as all part of their HOA. So they would be both a mandatory membership community for their little neighborhood and a mandatory master association for the bigger complex. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. Some other options that are in here are you may have a voluntary association. The neighborhood I live in has a swim tennis community. You don't have to join, but if you don't join, you don't get to use the pool or the tennis courts. Okay. So that's an optional association. Then we have our age restricted communities. And so there's a possibility it could be there. So if you're in an active adult community, it might be one of these. Then we're going to have the contact information for the associations. We're usually just going to be filling in section A. I've got the hiccups, I'm sorry. But if it's in a master association, we'll need both our local HOA and our master association. Then we need to know what is the annual fees that you pay to be a part of the association, and how is that billed? Do you pay for that monthly, quarterly, annually? It's going to ask about, are there any special assessments in the neighborhood? We discovered that there's a leak in the swimming pool in the neighborhood, and it's going to cost $30,000 to get that fixed and reopen the swimming pool. We don't have enough in the HOA account to cover that repair. And so we're going to do a special assessment, and we're going to charge every homeowner in the neighborhood $400 in order to raise the money to make that repair. Okay. You don't have a lot of special assessments in your typical HOAs. You will find them being pretty common in condominium associations. Okay. So what they're asking, are there any current assessments that are under consideration? Okay. These are not passed by the HOA. Are there any that are approved? And what are the outstanding amounts owed on it? Okay. And lastly, if between the time we go under contract and we get to the closing table, if the HOA approves a special assessment that's going to cost the buyer more than this number of dollars, then the buyer can terminate the contract within 5 days of being notified that that's being added to their expenses of purchase. Does that make sense so far?
Yes.
All right, good. One yes will have to do. All right, next paragraph. And this is why you don't want to fill this out. To the extent transfer, initiation, and administrative fees are fully and accurately disclosed by seller, Buyer shall pay blank dollars for all transfer, initiation, and administrative fees. So when you buy a house, there are typically different fees and costs associated with joining the HOA. And that can include your first year's HOA. It can include initiation fees, transfer fees, they can give it different names. But what this sentence is saying is the buyer's not going to have to pay any more than this right here at closing. Okay. This is why I don't want you filling it out. You're wanting to be helpful. You call the HOA for your client, and you end up talking to Becky, and Becky's just a sweet little lady, and she's so helpful, and she gets you all the information, and she lets you know that all the initiation fees and everything's going to be $500. Okay. Fast forward, we're a couple of days before closing when the closing attorney gets the letter, and then from the HOA of what's owed, and they put together the closing documents. Well, it turns out it's not $500, it's $1,500. Okay. Well, the seller said by signing this that the most that they were going to have to pay was $500. Who gets to pay the other $1,000? Contract says the seller. Okay. But who's the seller going to want to pay it? You.
You.
Mayor.
Because you're the one that filled that in. And this could be completely innocent. Becky could have been new at her job and gave you the wrong information. Maybe you misheard the information. Maybe Becky didn't understand the question and just told you what the annual fees were, not what the initiation fees were. It doesn't matter what the reason is. The seller's going to have to pay it. And if it's going to cost them $1,000 and you were the one that took on the responsibility of getting the right information and you got the wrong information, they're blaming you and they're going to expect you to pay that difference. Is anybody fond of the idea of paying $1,000 out of every closing for the HOA fees for the buyer for your listing?
No.
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 I don't want to do that. So I don't want you to do that. So always have them get this information. Now, I don't care if you get the phone number for the HOA and help get, or the email for the HOA and help get your seller connected with the HOA so they can get the answers, but have your client get the answers and have them fill this form out. Okay. Because this is what they're going to be held to at the closing table. Some of the additional questions they're going to ask is the HOA providing any of the utilities? Okay. And what is covered in the dues? Okay. When you pay your HOA dues, are you receiving any of this as part of that? They want to make sure the HOA is not in the process of suing, and that there is not any violations in existence with the property you're moving into. Because let's say that you were buying a house in a neighborhood and you moved into that house only to find out the very next day after you move in that the previous owners had painted the house a color that was not approved by the HOA, and they were going to fine you $100 a day until you repainted the house. How happy is your client going to be?
Not very.
Not very. Okay. So that's the reason those questions are in here. And then we get down to the signature page, have your seller sign it, and load this up to your listing in the MLS so that prospective buyers can download it. Okay. Any questions about the community association disclosure?
No. No.
Love it. All right. Next one, the disclosure on lead-based paint. And while there hasn't been any meaningful change to this form this year, there is a meaningful change that has taken place that hopefully is going to be a benefit to all of us. And that's on the listing agreement that we talked about a week or two ago. Now, you have to have the listing agreement when you take the listing. It is on the listing agreement as an exhibit. It is required to be there when you take the listing. So the days of wanting to make an offer on a property and the listing agent not having a lead-based paint exhibit, hopefully a ton of that is going away. Because the federal government requires that if the property was built before 1978, including any portion therein or any fixture to the property, that in order to have a binding contract, you have to have a lead-based paint exhibit fully executed. Okay. Well, we've struggled for years with listing agents not getting these done in a timely manner, and issues around trying to write contracts without it and not being able to have a binding contract. So this year they made the change that they're forcing listing agents to get this document at the listing. What that means, and something for you guys to pay attention to, is because when this is filled out by the seller, it's an attachment to the listing agreement, they're going to have to put an exhibit letter in here. Okay. So you as a buyer's agent, when you go to make your offer, one of the first things you should check is the lead-based paint exhibit and see what exhibit letter they gave. You shouldn't be seeing these without exhibit letters. If you do, just add it in there. But this is something we're on the buy side, we're going to be seeing before we make our offers more and more often. And we're not going to be beating our heads against the wall trying to get our hands on it. Hopefully, fingers crossed. So hopefully this is going to have an exhibit letter in here. We're going to have the property known as, put the address in here. And then each side has very specific roles. Okay. And it's important that things take place in the right order. And it's important that everybody signs in the right places, because this is potentially, out of all the things that you can do wrong, this form is a potential career ender, because there are 12 places that you have to pay attention to on this form. They're all easy, but you make a mistake on this form and you get audited by the EPA, it can be a $15,000 fine for every mistake. So if there's 12 places that they're looking and 15,000 per mistake, how much could that cost you if you screw this form up? How fast are you with the math?
A lot of money.
A lot of money. $180,000 is the maximum fine for not filling this out. And that is not covered by errors and omissions insurance. That is a fine to you personally. Okay. So do you think it's important that we fill this out correctly? Everybody say yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. And they've divided it up into really easy sections for us. So we have the seller's disclosure. So this is what we're going to be doing when we get the listing. We're going to have the seller's initial, either 1 or 2, under section A. There is known lead-based paint, or they have no knowledge of lead-based paint. That's pretty easy, right? Initials or initials. Under section B, records and reports available to the seller. 1, the seller's provided the buyer with all available records, or the seller has no reports or records pertaining to lead-based paint. So they're going to initial 1 up here. They're going to initial 1 right here. They're done with initialing. The seller's going to come back here and they're going to sign. That's the seller's responsibility. Okay. The listing agent, because we're doing this at the listing, right, is when we're first filling this out. They have to come in here and initial right here that the seller has informed the seller of the seller's obligations. Okay. The fact that they have to disclose anything that they know about lead-based paint or share any reports they have of lead-based paint. We have told them that. Okay. Then they're going to initial here and the listing agent's going to sign down here. Okay. All of that should be done at the listing. Okay. At the listing appointment. And then that should be uploaded to the MLS system. Now, when we're ready to make an offer, it's the buyer and the buyer's agent turn. Okay. So the seller had 2 places to initial. The buyer has 3. Number 1, the buyer has received copies of all the information, if any above. Even if the seller had no reports or records, even if they had no known information, the buyer needs to initial this box saying that they received all of that nothing. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? If they did have reports and they did have information, we're initialing to say we have that information. So regardless, the buyer needs to initial C. The buyer needs to initial that they've received the pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. Now, who would they get that form from or that brochure from?
From us.
From you. That is exactly right. 2 ways you can tackle that. You can share that with your client through DocuSign and have them initial it, which is what our broker loves to see happen. I'm okay if you just share it with them either through email so that you've got a documented record that you shared it, or if you share it without the signature through DocuSign. Because again, you've documented that you did your part and you make sure that they have it. Okay. Then they have to initial either 1 or 2 right here that they are asking for a 10-day opportunity to have the property inspected for lead, or that they're waiving the opportunity to test for lead. Okay. So they're going to initial C, they're going to initial D, and then they're going to initial one of these 2 options. We want the 10-day inspection period, or we don't want the 10-day inspection period. Okay. I'm okay with either one. I've been in hundreds of transactions. I've never had anybody do a lead-based paint inspection. Okay. You're probably not going to have one either. I've only heard of one person ever, even in the transactions I wasn't involved, that wanted to do the lead-based paint inspection. Okay. It just doesn't happen that often. That was 45 years ago now. Last time there was lead-based paint. Then the buyer is going to sign here and the buyer's agent's going to sign here. Okay. So count them with me, guys. If we have 2 sellers and 2 buyers, because couples are really common, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 places right here. There's 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 places that we're looking at. Okay, we need to make sure we have all of those correctly initialed and correctly signed. Now, with the way things are done right now, and them having to get the listing agreement, get the lead-based paint with their listing agreement, this should get really, really easy. But there's a lot of people out there that will tell you as a buyer's agent, well, just go ahead and fill in your portion of the lead-based paint exhibit, and then I'll have the seller fill in theirs. Does that work?
No,
No. Because down here, we're saying that we've received everything the seller said they had. Okay. Can I hear what you're saying before you say it?
no,
No. Okay. The seller has to sign this first. That's really important. Okay. This always has to initiate with the seller doing their part first, because they have to tell us what they know before we can acknowledge what they know. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Love it. Any questions about the lead-based paint exhibit? All right. Then we're moving on to the easy one, and that is the DeKalb County plumbing disclosure. So we're going to leave the exhibit letter blank, just like we did on the others. Leave the offer date blank. We're going to fill in our address, and then we're going to have the seller initial it. That's the whole form. Okay. Well, what's the purpose of the form? Why do we have this? Why does my seller need to sign it? DeKalb County has had lots of water and sewer issues in the past, and this form has been around for the last decade. Because DeKalb County does not have as large of a supply of water as other areas in the metro Atlanta area, they are very, very serious about water conservation. Okay. So when a buyer goes to get their water turned on at DeKalb County wants a certificate that says that there are low flow devices installed in the property. Low flow toilets, low flow shower heads, low flow sinks, okay, as a way to conserve water. Well, this is a warning to the buyer from the seller. Hey, this property is in unincorporated DeKalb County, and it was built prior to 1993, and you might have some issues with getting your water connected if you don't have that certificate or meet certain criteria. Okay, so if the property was built after 1993, DeKalb County knows it already has low flow fixtures in it, so they're not worried about that. Okay, if it's in incorporated DeKalb County, meaning it's in the city limits of Decatur, meaning it's in the city limits of Tucker. Okay, if it's in the city limits, the county's not responsible for policing it. The city's responsible for policing it. So this form only applies to unincorporated DeKalb County for property built before 1993. Living where we live, are we going to need to use this form very often?
Probably not.
Probably not, but I wanted you guys to know that it's there in case you ever need it, or in case you ever see it, you know what it is. Okay. And it's just a warning to the buyer to exercise caution. Now, how does a buyer get that certificate that they have low flow devices? Every home inspector that does business in DeKalb County knows this law and is in a position to write that certificate that they'll need to go get their water. Okay. This is only going to become an issue is if they don't do a traditional home inspection. If they do a traditional home inspection, getting that certificate is part of the deal. Okay. Some of the other exceptions is if the home is being foreclosed on, if they're going to be completely tearing the house down and rebuilding it, or doing massive renovations to it and replacing all the fixtures, they don't need it. Or if because of some issue with the property, installing low flow devices is going to be incredibly expensive. Okay, so for example, the cost to install water conserving plumbing exceeds $1,000 per toilet. So if you are in a 2-bathroom house, if you were to replace all of your faucets in the kitchen, the bathrooms, the showers, the baths, and your toilets, if that's going to be more than $2,000, they're going to be able to get their water turned on anyways, because that's just too high of a bill for your typical family. Okay. If it's a commercial property, it's got to be higher than $2,000 for every toilet that's in there. So again, you're probably not going to see this very often. Even if you are doing business in DeKalb County, there's a high probability that it's going to be in incorporated, not unincorporated DeKalb County, and was built after 1993, not before 1993. So just know when this is applicable and use it when you need it. How do we
I have
do
a
today,
question.
guys?
You
Yes.
did great as always, Trey. But if the house is built in 1933,
Yep.
you need it?
You need it. If it's in unincorporated DeKalb County, you will need it.
Okay.
Okay.
How do we
And
determine
if
it?
the sorry.
I'm sorry, how do we determine if it's unincorporated?
You should be able to find out, are they having to pay city taxes? Is it inside the city limits? You know,
Okay.
even let's take Tucker as an example. There's a lot of places that have a Tucker address, but aren't in the city limits of Tucker. But if you go to the Tucker website, the City of Tucker website, and go look for their city limits, you'll be able to look on the map and see, is it in or out of the city limits of Tucker?
Okay.
So that's
so-
what you would that's what you would do if the place is in Atlanta too?
That's what I do for places in Atlanta too. Is it in the city limits of Decatur or not? Is it in the city limits of Atlanta or not?
Okay.
Trey, what
Yes.
if it's an investor that did not do a home inspection?
Well, they may need to do one, or they'll need to provide documentation that they replaced all of the faucets. If they replaced the faucets in the toilet as part of their renovation, great. All you've got to do is provide the receipts that here's where we installed low flow devices. They'll have no problem getting their water turned on.
Okay.
Okay. All right. You know, the one I'm doing now that kind of stuck out to me. This one, this is the easy exhibit, but that kind of stuck out.
Yeah, it should be the easy one. It's the one you're going to use the least often, but it is a little bit tricky because in the whole state of Georgia, 230 something counties, DeKalb is the only one that has this.
Right.
It's kind of crazy.
Yes, it is. But thank you so much. I've learned a lot as always.
Well, thank you, Lenora. I appreciate it. All right, everybody, go have a fantastic weekend. Call me, text me, email me if you need me. Okay.
To you as well. Thanks.
All right.
Thanks, Trey. Thank you.
Bye, guys.